Marbling can be a lot of different things. There are a lot of ways to do it, and there are a lot of different supplies that you can use, from acrylics to ink and to other things. Here I used acrylic paint because this is what I usually work with, and I used 3 different techniques of marbling that I usually use on 2 of the different paintings so that it's very clear what the difference is. I usually work with watercolor paper and I love using it, but I did run into some issues with it that led me to think if maybe there is another way or a better way to do this, and that's what led me on this whole experiment to begin with. So I'm just gonna list the things that I love about working with watercolor paper and the things that I don't love so much, and I'm going to do the same for canvas. So I'm taking us with me down the street to my local art store supplies that I go to all the time, and it's gonna be fun. We're gonna buy some canvas and some other things, and this is actually really early in the morning in my town. I am never up this early, and it's fun to see what's it like. The first thing on that list, and the things that I love the most about working with watercolor paper, is the beautiful little effects that appear on the paper when the water and the paint touches it. And it's something that I found pretty unique to watercolor paper, and it's also the thing that I love most with working with it. So the second thing on my list is the way that the watercolor paper is able to hold so much water and paint in it that makes it really easy to control the movement of the paint. And I guess it has to do also with the quality of the paper. So if it's higher quality, it's going to be better at doing that. But it's something that is also very convenient for me personally with working with watercolor paper and marble art specifically. The last thing on the watercolor pros list is that it's very easy to create all these little effects using just water. So if you take the paper and you put some water on it and then you put your paint on it, it creates all these little effects, and it fades out in this really pretty way. And I guess it can happen on canvas too, but you would have to put a little bit of paint on it first, and also it won't look the same. We move on to the list of the watercolor paper cons and the things that make it a little bit harder to work with it. And the first thing, and if you ever used watercolor paper, then you know this issue, it's when the paper bends. And if there's a lot of water involved, the paper usually bends, and that makes it a lot more difficult to control the movement of the paint. And it's very important with marble art specifically because you really want to control the movement of the paint and the water in the way that you want. So if the paper bends, it becomes more difficult to do it because the water and the paint moves in the specific way that the paper bent. So the second thing is framing. So with watercolor painting, when you're done painting and you want to hang your art or even sell it, you're going to have to find a solution for the frame. So if you don't want to use glass to frame it, you're going to have some kind of a workshop at home with wood panels and some tools to make the frame yourself. And there are actually a lot of really good tutorials on YouTube on how to do that, but it does complicate things if you just want to paint and be done, and maybe you don't want to really deal with that. And that is something that I'm facing right now because I really want to hang my own things that I made, and without having all the tools at home, I'm going to have to either get some stuff or just hang my art on the wall with some duct tape. And by the way, that's the situation right now that's happening on my walls. And that's all for the cons on watercolor paper. There aren't a lot of issues with it. It's just that the technicalities of it can kind of drive you insane. So unless you're gonna upgrade to a better watercolor brand, and that is always a possibility, but it can be more pricey. So all of the things that makes working with watercolor paper more difficult are actually the things that are gonna make working with canvas easier. So the first thing that's gonna make working with canvas a little bit easier than working with watercolor paper is the fact that it doesn't bend. So that makes it easier to control the movement of the paint on a surface that stays flat. So the second good thing with canvas is that it's already framed. So when you're done, you're actually done, and you don't have to do any additional framing unless you want to. So the last thing that was great about working with canvas is that even though I used a little bit of water mixed in with my paint, it still held all the water and the paint in it, and it also displayed the intensity of the colors fairly well, and it wasn't even that fancy of a canvas. So we move on to the list of the cons in working with canvas. What I didn't like so much about working with canvas is that in some areas, and maybe it's because I use too much water, but in some areas you can see the texture of the cloth underneath the paint. But it's not actually that terrible, and you can get used to it. The second thing is that in some areas you can see these tiny little white dots, and it happened because the layer of the paint was too thin in that area. If I wanted to fix this, I probably would take a small brush and I would fill in these spaces. But if the painting has really small and fine details, it can ruin it. The last thing that I learned on this experiment is that if you want to change the colors and maybe add some more and the canvas is still wet, it's not going to work out very well, and sometimes it's going to leave these blank spaces instead. So I had to wait until the canvas was dry to add more paint, and with watercolor paper, that kind of what makes it work so well is that when the paper is wet is the time to really make all the changes. So that is it for my list on the good things and the not so good things on both of these methods. I do think that for some specific methods of marble art, one of these options are going to be better. For example, if you use cups, acrylic cups, and you want a quick and easy result, I think canvas would be the way to go. You just have to try and see what fits for you. And I think for me, I will also keep experimenting and figuring out what's the best way from me. And that's it for now.